Hey guys, tonight we're heading to the shores of a vast, tranquil lake. A place so stunningly beautiful and so full of life, it felt more like a dream than a city. Imagine you're standing on a narrow causeway, a gentle breeze rustling the reeds that line the water. All around you, as far as the eye can see, are vibrant green islands, lush with corn and tomatoes and marigolds. These aren't natural islands, though. They're man-made rafts of mud and reeds, crisscrossed with canals, each one a tiny floating farm. This isn't some fantasy world. This is Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire. This is what it was like to live in a city built on a lake, where every single morning you woke up surrounded by water and the quiet rustle of your own floating garden. You probably wouldn't survive a single week here, though. Not because of a lack of corn, but because the relentless, gentle, and utterly specific pace of life would drive you mad. The world moved at the speed of growing corn. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes and try to picture it. You're not in your bed anymore. You're on the edge of Lake Texcoco, where the city of Tenochtitlan stands on its marshy foundation. This city was so large and so organized that by some estimates, it was home to more than 200,000 people. It was, in its time, one of the biggest cities in the world. But it wasn't just the population that made it remarkable. It was the way the city worked with its environment, not against it. Because Tenochtitlan was built in the middle of a massive lake system, it was surrounded by water. Not always the cleanest, I'll grant you, but water nonetheless. The Aztecs, like any good city planners, needed a way to feed all those people, and the land they were living on was, well, it was mostly soggy lake bed. What's a king to do when his land is more pond than pasture? You might think they'd fill in the lake, but the Aztecs had a far more elegant and, frankly, more relaxing solution. They created the land they needed. They built what we now call chinampas, or floating gardens. Imagine a giant rectangular raft, woven from reeds and willow branches. You anchor that raft to the lake bed with long stakes, which later sprout into trees. Then you start dredging the rich, black muck from the lake bottom, all that soft, nutrient-rich sediment that makes for amazing fertilizer. You pile it on top of your woven raft, and before you know it, you've got a garden. It sounds like a lot of work, and it was, but the result was a piece of farmland so fertile, so perfectly watered by the lake below, that you could harvest crops multiple times a year. Some scholars still argue about whether they were technically floating or simply built up from the lake bed, but for our sleepy purposes, let's just pretend they gently bobbed. This wasn't just a clever farming technique. It was the foundation of an entire civilization. These floating gardens fed an empire, and the gentle, cyclical nature of their creation and cultivation became a kind of quiet heartbeat for the city itself. You can almost hear it now, can't you? The soft splashing of mud being dredged, the rhythmic weaving of reeds, the quiet hum of a city that has perfected the art of turning water into bread. You are there, surrounded by the soft sounds of a civilization that built its entire existence on a simple, yet profound, agricultural wonder. This clever system, this invention called the chinampa, was truly the secret sauce of Aztec civilization. And if you're a quiet, detail-oriented person, you'd have been right at home, because the creation of a chinampa was an almost meditative process. It was a slow and gentle form of engineering. First, you'd gather a bunch of long, straight reeds and willow branches from the lake's edge. You'd weave them together to form a large, rectangular mat, kind of like a giant, very sturdy basket. Imagine the soft, rhythmic sound of reeds being woven together, the slight rustle and pop as you bend them into place. You'd probably sing a little song to yourself as you worked, a quiet melody to match the steady pace of your hands. This mat wasn't the whole garden, though. It was just the foundation. The real magic came next. With your mat in place, you'd use a long pole, or maybe a simple bucket tied to a rope, to scoop up the rich, dark mud from the lake floor. This stuff was a natural compost, a slurry of decaying plants and organic matter that had been settling for centuries. It was the perfect fertilizer. You'd spread this mud layer by layer onto your woven mat. Each scoop, each spread, was a deliberate, calm action. You'd watch as the deep black mud covered the reeds, slowly building up a new piece of land. And since the lake was teeming with nutrients, the soil was constantly being fed from below, creating a self-sustaining system of perfect, fertile land. As you built up your new garden, you'd drive long, slender stakes into the corners and sides of the rectangle. These stakes were often saplings from willow trees, and they weren't just for anchoring the garden. Over time, these stakes would take root, growing into tall, strong trees that would serve as a natural fence and a windbreak. Their roots would also intertwine with the mud and reeds, creating an even stronger, more permanent foundation. This is a bit of a fringe tidbit, but some historians believe that the word chinampa itself comes from Nahuatl words meaning on the fence of reeds, which sounds so much more poetic than floating farm. This process was repeated over and over again, creating a lattice of canals and gardens that covered thousands of acres of the lake. It was a completely man-made landscape, a testament to human ingenuity, but it had a gentle, natural feel to it. The entire city of Tenochtitlan was built on this concept, this idea of creating something beautiful and productive out of what seemed like empty, useless space. It was a kind of quiet defiance against the elements, a slow and steady reshaping of the world. It wasn't like building a skyscraper with loud noises and heavy machinery. It was more like gardening on a truly colossal scale, a quiet and patient act of creation. The only noise would have been the gentle lapping of water against the edges of the chinampas, the soft thud of mud being deposited, and the peaceful hum of a civilization at work. It's almost enough to make you sleepy just thinking about it. Once the chinampa was established, the real work and the real story began, because these floating gardens weren't just farms. They were living calendars. You see, the Aztecs, like many ancient civilizations, were deeply attuned to the natural world. They didn't just look at the sun and the stars to tell time. They looked at the earth too. And on the chinampas, the earth was speaking to them constantly. The planting and harvesting of crops followed a precise, predictable cycle, a rhythm that was as reliable as the movement of the stars. It was a kind of gentle, agricultural clock. You'd get up with the sun, and your first task would be to check on your crops. You'd walk along the narrow paths, or maybe paddle a small canoe through the canals. You'd check for weeds, for pests, for signs of a good harvest to come. And what you planted depended on the time of year. In the spring, you'd plant maize or corn. This was the staple of the Aztec diet, and it was the most important crop. But you'd also plant beans, which would grow up the corn stalks, and squash, which would spread out on the ground below. This system, known as the Three Sisters to many indigenous cultures, was a beautifully symbiotic one, each plant helping the others to grow. The timing of these plantings was crucial, and it was directly tied to the Aztec calendar. The Aztecs had two main calendars, a 365-day solar calendar for agricultural purposes, and a 260-day ritual calendar for religious ceremonies. The solar calendar was divided into 18 months of 20 days each, with 5 unlucky days at the end. The planting cycles of the chinampas followed this solar calendar, with specific months dedicated to preparing the soil, planting the seeds, and finally, harvesting the crops. The gentle work of the chinampa was a daily meditation on the passage of time. This is a fun fringe fact, but the Aztecs also used the movement of the sun's shadow over their ceremonial calendar stones to track the seasons. So, while the priests in the temple were looking up at the sky, you, the humble farmer, were looking down at your garden, and both of you were reading the same clock. The chinampa was a smaller, more intimate version of the grand calendar stone in the city's center. It was a personal calendar that you could tend with your own two hands. Of course, the floating gardens weren't just for food. You'd also grow flowers, bright marigolds and dahlias, for example, which were used in religious ceremonies and to decorate homes. The cycle of planting and harvesting these flowers also marked the passage of time, with specific flowers blooming at different times of the year. This gentle ebb and flow of life on the chinampas was a constant, soothing reminder of the natural world's rhythms. It was a world where time wasn't a rush to a deadline, but a slow, peaceful dance with the seasons. Life on a chinampa wasn't just a matter of planting and harvesting. It was a deeply ingrained lifestyle. It was a life lived at the speed of slow-growing things. Your days would be measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the progress of the crops. You'd wake up to the gentle chirping of birds and the rustle of the wind through the tall corn stalks. As the sun rose, you'd paddle your small canoe, called a canoa, through the narrow channels between the gardens. The water would be still and cool, reflecting the brilliant colors of the sunrise. It was a peaceful commute, far more serene than any modern-day traffic jam, though you might have to dodge a fellow chinampero or two. A typical day means lots of chill tasks. You'd be weeding, gently pulling out pesky plants that try to steal the spotlight from your maze. It's kind of a relaxing, almost zen vibe. Your hands would be in the rich, damp soil, feeling the cool earth and the tender roots of the young plants. You'd also be keeping an eye out for pests, like insects or rodents. You'd have to be quick, but not frantic, to protect your precious harvest. And of course, there was the constant upkeep of the garden itself, replacing reeds, adding new layers of mud from the lakebed, and making sure the willow stakes were still strong. Historians still argue about the exact division of labor on the chinampas. While we know that both men and women were involved, the precise roles are a bit fuzzy. It's likely that men did the heavier work, like dredging mud and building the garden structures, while women were responsible for the daily weeding, planting, and harvesting. But this is just a scholarly debate, and we can just as easily imagine a family working together, with everyone pitching in on all the tasks. The important thing is that it was a communal, gentle effort, a shared rhythm of life. One of the quirky tidbits about this period is the sheer variety of food they grew. We often think of the Aztecs as just eating corn, but that's not quite right. While maize was the main staple, they also grew a surprising number of other things on their floating gardens, including various kinds of beans, squash, amaranth, tomatoes, and chiles. They even cultivated flowers and herbs for medicinal purposes. You'd have a little kitchen garden right outside your door, full of fresh ingredients for that night's meal. It's the kind of quiet, self-sufficient lifestyle that sounds so appealing now, doesn't it? The only real challenge would be keeping track of all those different plants and their needs. But with the gentle pace of life, you'd have plenty of time. The chinampas were more than just a source of food. They were a living, breathing part of Aztec society. Their role extended far beyond mere agriculture, weaving itself into the social fabric of Tenochtitlan. Think of them as a kind of all-purpose land, a combination of a garden, a park, and a workshop all in one. Because the Aztecs didn't just grow corn and beans. They also used these floating plots to cultivate a dizzying array of flowers, and these blooms were incredibly important in their religious ceremonies and for personal adornment. For example, you might have a plot of land entirely dedicated to marigolds, or cempasúchil in the Nahuatl language. These vibrant orange flowers were associated with the sun and were used in a wide variety of ceremonies. The sight and smell of thousands of marigolds blooming on the lake would have been truly breathtaking. It was a kind of gentle, natural art installation, a constantly changing tapestry of color and scent. It wasn't just for show, though. The flowers were a way to honor the gods and to mark the turning of the seasons. It was a kind of gentle, fragrant calendar, a beautiful way to mark the passage of time. This leads to a really interesting fringe tidbit. The Aztecs had a deep appreciation for beauty, and their society was full of poets and artists. The canals between the chinampas were often used for leisurely canoe rides, where people could drift lazily through the floating gardens and enjoy the flowers and the quiet surroundings. It was a kind of natural, serene park, a place to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. You can almost imagine yourself paddling a small boat down one of these canals, the only sound the soft splash of your paddle and the rustling of the leaves. Historians still argue about the exact number of chinampas that existed and the extent to which they were used for purely aesthetic purposes. While it's clear they were primarily for food production, it's also clear that the Aztecs saw no conflict between the useful and the beautiful. The gardens were a perfect blend of both. It was a world where a farm could also be a place of quiet contemplation and beauty. It's a gentle reminder that for the Aztecs, the land was not just a resource to be exploited, but a partner to be nurtured. The floating gardens were a testament to this philosophy, a peaceful and harmonious way of life that sounds almost like a lullaby. The floating gardens, or chinampas, did more than just feed a city and provide a place for quiet reflection. They were, in a very real sense, a kind of clock. Not a clock with gears and hands, of course, but a clock that kept time on a much smaller, more intimate scale. If you were a chinampero, the rhythms of the garden were the rhythms of your life. The slow process of growth and decay, of planting and harvesting, was a constant, soothing measure of the passing days and weeks. Imagine waking up one morning and seeing the first tiny sprouts of corn peeking out of the rich, dark soil. That was a moment of time, a milestone. You'd know that it had been a certain number of weeks since you'd planted the seeds. And as the sprouts grew into tall, sturdy stalks, you'd know that the season was progressing, that the harvest was getting closer. The garden was a living, breathing calendar, a quiet record of your life and your work. It was a calendar that you could feel with your hands and see with your own eyes. It was a kind of gentle, agricultural ASMR, a soft and constant hum of life. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. A theory exists that the Aztecs used the chinampas as a form of census. By keeping track of who worked which plots and what they were growing, the state could get a rough idea of the population and food production. It was a quiet and non-invasive way to keep track of a vast number of people, simply by observing the gentle rhythms of their lives. It's a much more peaceful way to take a census than, say, sending out a bunch of bureaucrats with clipboards and a long list of questions. Historians still argue about the extent to which this was a formalized system. Was it a deliberate method of population control, or was it a happy accident, a natural byproduct of a highly organized society? We don't know for sure, but it's a lovely thought, isn't it? That a whole society could be measured and understood by the simple, quiet act of planting and harvesting on a floating garden. It's a testament to the idea that the most profound truths can often be found in the most mundane places. The chinampas were a gentle reminder that the world is always in motion, even when we are standing still. Of course, all stories must come to an end, and so too did the story of the chinampas as the central heartbeat of a civilization. The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century brought with it a series of changes that would slowly but surely chip away at the gentle world you have come to know. The conquerors had different ideas about land, water, and how a city should function. They saw the lake not as a partner to be worked with, but as an obstacle to be drained. And so, over the centuries, the lake was gradually filled in, the canals were paved over, and the floating gardens were left to decay. A quirky, final tidbit here. Some historians believe that the Spanish, in their zeal to civilize the Aztecs, deliberately filled in the lake and destroyed the chinampas as a way of erasing their culture and breaking their connection to the land. It was a kind of slow, methodical destruction, far more insidious than any single battle. The gentle rhythm of the floating gardens was replaced by the harsh, unyielding rhythm of European-style agriculture and city planning. The quiet hum of the chinampa was silenced forever. Historians still argue about the precise timeline of this decline. Did it happen all at once? Or was it a slow, painful process that took centuries? We can't know for sure, but we can imagine what it must have been like. The floating gardens, once so vibrant and full of life, would have slowly faded away, their reeds and mud collapsing into the now stagnant water. The gentle clock that had measured the days and weeks would have stopped ticking, and a new, more frantic clock would have taken its place. And yet, the story isn't entirely over. The legacy of the chinampas still exists. In a quiet, often overlooked corner of Mexico City, in the borough of Xochimilco, there are still some of these ancient floating gardens in use today. You can take a peaceful ride on a trajinera, a colorful flat-bottomed boat, and drift through the last remaining canals. It's a quiet, beautiful echo of a world that once was, a final, gentle lullaby from a civilization that built its empire on the simple, soothing rhythms of a garden. So, as we drift away from this watery world and back to your own warm, comfortable bed, you can carry that image with you. The gentle sound of water lapping against the sides of a floating garden. The soft rustle of corn stalks in the breeze. The feeling of cool, rich mud on your hands. It's a peaceful, quiet thought to drift off to. You are safe and sound, and the floating gardens of the Aztecs are still there, in a quiet corner of the world, waiting to be rediscovered by your sleepy mind. Sweet dreams.